Good afternoon. I'm Mary Beth Vitale. We appreciate you joining us for the latest in our Compensation Committee webinar series. Today we will hear Pearl Meyer's top 5 strategic agenda items for the coming year. Some of our recent webinars in this series have focused on aligning compensation to business strategy, and you will hear a bit more about that in the context of some research on total shareholder return that Pearl Meyer conducted with Cornell University. We will also touch on some emerging trends to consider, including strategic use of equity pay and what you can and even should be doing now to get ready for the upcoming disclosure requirements. And finally, we'll conclude with the topic of director pay, which is beginning to receive some scrutiny as well as media attention. I'm joined today by Alap Shah and Sharon Podstupka with Pearl Meyer, and they're going to provide some relevant and actionable advice on these topics that you can take back to your committee meetings in 2016. But before we begin, Ronell Perry with our NACD's education team has a few housekeeping announcements. Ronell?
Great. Thank you, Mary Beth. Audience, thank you for joining us. Feel free to submit a question to our live experts in the console screen. You can type the question, and they'll do their best to respond during the presentation. You can also tweet live with us at NACD and at Pearl Meyer. Also, in the lower right-hand corner, you can download the presentation and access additional resources. Slides will be available early next week at the URL on the screen, and they are currently available within the console on the right lower-hand side. Remember that if you're an NACD fellow, you will receive 1 NACD credit for your participation. This credit can be applied to your fellowship, and you can find out more information about the fellowships by emailing the address on the screen. The replay and slides will be available early next week at nacdonline.org and pearlmeyer.com. Mary Beth, back to you.
Thanks, Ronell. As I mentioned, we're going to focus today on some things that you should consider as a compensation committee member in 2016. Many of us at this time of the year are already looking ahead, making plans and resolutions. I believe every board wants to begin the new year with an actionable plan for long-term value creation. And we all know, however, that the number of competing concerns at the full board and the committee level is growing, and it can be tough to identify which should be top of mind and receive extra attention. I want you all to keep in mind, as directors, this is your responsibility to work with the chair and or lead director in helping to plan your board agenda, or the chair of the comp committee in helping to plan the committee's agenda. Pearl Meyer has identified 5 key strategic issues that the comp committee should consider as areas of focus. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon to give us the information along those lines. Sharon?
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. As we move on to our next slide, among the issues on the horizon for 2016, as Mary Beth mentioned in our opening, there are a select few that we believe should be at the top of your list. We're really looking forward to diving into each of these topics over the next 45 minutes or so and hope to spark some engaging dialogue along the way. So let's take a quick look at what we'll be discussing. A big continuation from 2015, but igniting more and more debate, is how, when, and why we use total shareholder return. Today we're going to talk about what we've learned about TSR as an incentive measure through our research with Cornell University and how it should or shouldn't continue to play a role in your incentive programs. In fact, it's such a hot priority topic that it actually takes up the first 2 slots here in our top 5. Third on our list is equity compensation. The questions that we are asking are, can it should be leveraged differently to drive the engagement or change the behaviors of your leaders? How long should people have skin in the game? Number 4 on our list, not nearly as exciting as number 3, but certainly as critical, is about our new disclosure rules. 2015 brought us a wave of new disclosure rules that, while not imminent, we know will creep up on us very quickly. And we believe that now is the time to use your runway and start planning, not only to ensure that your proxy statements are clear and sound when it's time to file, but that your organizations are prepared for any unintended internal consequences. And finally, number 5 on the list for 2016 is directors' pay, which is clearly a hot topic and ripe for debates, especially in this time of increased shareholder activism. Is there something we should be doing differently given today's heightened levels of scrutiny? And should we be considering different approaches? So with that, I'm going to ask Alap to take over and bring us through the majority of the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. So starting off with the first agenda item that we think should be considered is putting TSR in its proper context. And what that means is really understanding some of the findings from our recent study with Cornell University. The first point is that there's been a significant increase in the use of total shareholder return in incentive programs, primarily long-term incentive programs. However, some companies are actually implementing total shareholder return in annual incentive programs. Point number 2, note there really, based on the study, there really wasn't any demonstrated evidence that TSR leads to increased performance. Although it can be a greater indicator of value creation over a long-term period, i.e. 10 years, the limitation of using something like total shareholder return is that the executive's impact is not as direct as other metrics. And there are likely other performance metrics that have a better ability to impact value creation over a shorter time period. So I'd like to turn your attention to the chart on the bottom right of the page. And so we decided to delve deeper into understanding what was behind the increased prevalence in TSR. And as you can see from the chart, 90% of respondents believe that alignment was an important reason to include total shareholder return in incentive metric. Now, we don't question that, but I do not believe that total shareholder return itself is actually the metric that would be able to drive performance. So I think that may be a debatable point by some, but in reviewing and designing multiple incentive programs, we haven't seen a good enough correlation to indicate that it is a main driver of performance. The other thing that I think the survey results highlight, which is quite interesting, is that if you look at the bottom 3 reasons, peer practices, responding to investor concerns, and responding to proxy advisory groups, there seems to be a bit of a chicken or the egg situation here. And are peer practices and investor concerns being driven by the responses from proxy advisory groups, or are investor concerns actually driving the view that proxy advisory groups have? Either way, I think what these results do is highlight 2 very dangerous trends, which are, one, in terms of peer practices. This is what I characterize as jumping off the bridge because someone else is doing it type of rationale. And the second, which is responding to proxy advisory firms, is characterized as he or she told me so. So from our perspective, just as when we were children, and neither of those reasons are good indicators of doing anything, they shouldn't be good indicators of adopting a practice that's going to drive incentive programs for your executives. And then the last point is this prevalence, about 75% of respondents indicating that the desire to have TSR is that it ends up establishing a balance to existing financial metrics. I think the challenge on that is that and the question to ask yourselves is, do you really need to balance your financial metrics if your financial metrics are appropriately correlated to value creation. And I think that's an important point to consider, and leads actually to the next slide, which is, if not TSR, then what? And what we find here is that as companies are increasing in prevalence in terms of adopting total shareholder return, what they're doing is they're actually putting less weight on it. So what this indicates in terms of the findings is that companies don't actually think it's the right thing to do, or are not sure if it's the right thing to do. So what happens is that you're missing an opportunity to place a greater emphasis on a meaningful existing metric that has potentially a demonstrated correlation to value creation, or adding other metrics that have that ability to create value over the time period of your performance period. So as companies think about what to do instead of total shareholder return, I think if you look at the chart on the bottom right here, there's a series of steps that are pretty common for all companies to go through in terms of digesting whether including total shareholder return or some other metric, is appropriate in their incentive programs. Now, for many organizations, it may be easier to start at the top of the pyramid, while others actually find it easier to start at the base. Regardless of where you start in terms of asking yourself the questions are pretty much the same. So just starting at the top of the pyramid, what you want to decide is what is the goal of the incentive program, and over what time period are you trying to accomplish it? And for many organizations, that goal will be to maximize shareholder value. Second question is, how do you get there? And what are the hurdles? This is an ineffective strategy. And then you get into more granular detail about regarding what are the operational measures that drive the strategy, and how does that translate to measurable financial or non-financial metrics. And those two pieces are the operational drivers as well as the financial metrics are very interrelated. And so what you want to make sure is that you fully understand what are the underlying processes that would end up supporting those specific operating decisions, and then making sure that those operating decisions actually link back to your strategy and your goal. So in effect, you're probably running up and down this pyramid as you go about designing what is the appropriate incentive program, and what are the appropriate what are the appropriate metrics. So going to the next slide. Now that you have an outline for how to derive the appropriate value creation metrics, I think it's important to understand what are the objectives of the compensation program, and what are the potential trade-offs between those particular objectives. And once that is understood, I think it'll be fairly apparent what are the appropriate metrics. So have you determined once you've determined what are the metrics to achieve the business strategy, and put that against what are the objectives of your compensation program, and they should cross-check one another. And as you so once the initial metrics are determined, then a series of questions comes into play, which are these measures easy to understand by the individuals that are going to be governed by the incentive program? Do they truly identify and focus on financial metrics that are talked about within your company, the industry, and as well as in the macro environment for your particular company? And are you incorporating an appropriate mix between lag performance metrics that reward achievement, and also lead performance metrics? I must say there is an overabundance of programs. there is an overabundance of programs out there that focus primarily on lag metrics. But for instance, in some of the clients I work with, what we have introduced in the incentive program to actually a very positive result is looking at some lead metrics. For instance, in the software as a service space, new buying partners ends up being a very important lead metric, because that will in effect lead to revenue in future years, as well as value creation over time. And another metric being churn. And so these are the type of lead metrics that are important to incorporate in any incentive program.
Olive, I have a question for you. Really, when it comes to the committee chair and the board, when they make the decision to maybe not choose TSR, how detrimental is that going to be when they kind of are bucking the trend and decide the TSR is not right for them and they should use another method, which you've kind of gone through? And I understand process is key, but what do you think any reaction will be if a company chooses not to use that?
Right, and so first I'll say, I think if a company is appropriately assessing and deciding on performance metrics that are leading to value creation, I think in effect you won't have a detrimental impact in terms of the result of the incentive program. You're actually probably going to have a very positive impact for the recipients of the program, as well as value creation for shareholders. However, the detrimental impact that is potentially very acute is how to explain it. And with that, I think that it is definitely a communication challenge. So some things that companies can do is actively engage with their shareholders and show them how the performance metrics that they have selected appropriately align to long-term value creation. And really have that conversation on an annual basis to ensure that the shareholders themselves understand why the company is selecting certain metrics and how that is going to essentially create a return for them. And maybe Sharon has a few other thoughts on how effectively that can be communicated.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it spot on, and the real challenge is taking the time to make sure that you're explaining it in such a way that different types of stakeholder groups can really understand what you're trying to accomplish. So, writing to not only your investor audience, but also the proxy advisor audience, and even the general population, to make sure that people really understand how your business drives results.
Right, and if you absolutely must incorporate, some of the mitigating impact of selecting a financial metric or a non-financial metric that's not TSR in your incentive program. Could be that you use total shareholder return as a performance modifier, because our study results with Cornell University did indicate that total shareholder return does align with value creation over the long term. So what you could potentially have is a modifier where if total shareholder return is negative over the performance period, then you cannot achieve a full payout on the incentive program. And so that ends up incorporating total shareholder return, mitigating some shareholder concerns or pressure, but at the same time allowing the management team to be focused on the operational or financial metrics that are most important. So I think we can turn it over to Sharon now to go through a polling question.
Yes. So we'd like to get everybody involved in the discussion. So we had a couple of polling questions that we'll go through throughout the course of our webinar here. And our first one is, what does your compensation committee or full board feel is the right time frame for assessing value creation? We've got 3 answers here from which to choose: 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, or more.
Frankly, I'm actually quite curious about what the result here is going to be, given that, not to impact any of the results, but given that the vast majority of long-term incentive programs that are performance-based end up being over a 3-year period. And I think, the results here will, potentially tie into some shareholder concerns out there as to are long-term incentive programs actually long-term enough.
So are we ready to see some results? Okay. Is this surprising?
It's not particularly surprising based on what I just said, that the majority of performance long-term incentive performance contingent programs have a 3-year performance period. However, in a sense, it is a bit surprising because I would have thought that if you think about value creation and what you want the company to do over a period of time, 3 years seems to be a very short time frame for a company to implement potentially a new strategy if they're pivoting or it seems to be a very short time frame for, say, a new executive, a new CEO to come in and actually make inroads into creating significant value for shareholders. So, Mary Beth, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Olive, I totally agree with you on that. It is a very short time frame, but I think what we need to keep in mind here, and I'd like to get yours and Sharon's opinion on this, is that, you've got institutional investors like a BlackRock who looks out, 5 years, and then you have, 80% of your institutional holdings of, usually 80% of your company's holdings are held by institutions, and about half of them tend to be like a BlackRock, and then you've got the other half that's a hedge fund that have really short-term horizons in many times. How does a board and a comp committee deal with that when you have, half looking at a longer horizon and the other half looking at a short horizon when you start to look at long-term value creation? What can that committee and board do?
No, I think that's actually a great question, and just throwing out a few ideas here is that you can, if you have a long-term incentive program that has overlapping performance periods, and you have consistency in the metrics that you're using over time, so in effect, not changing the metrics annually, but keeping the same metrics into place, even the same weightings for say 2-3 cycles, then that ends up creating this long-term consistency that helps balance the different time periods of your investors. And frankly, the other point is that I'm very much a personal believer in that value creation needs to be considered on a long-term basis. There's too much macro pressure, industry-specific pressure that occurs for companies for them to be focused on sort of the 2-year horizon or even just the 3-year horizon. So if you have to choose between the two, I think, for myself, 9 times out of 10, as long as you have visibility in terms of setting your goals appropriately, I would choose the sort of 5-year horizon or even greater.
And hopefully that'll help with the longevity of a new CEO because they have a short lifespan. So if you look out 5 years, that should help.
Great.
Should we move on to our next polling question?
Yeah, we're not done with this topic yet. I know it's a hot topic.
It is. Okay, so our next question for our audience: would your compensation committee be under pressure or receive pushback if you remove TSR from the incentive plan? So we have four options here: yes, no, unsure of reaction, and we don't currently have TSR in our incentive plan.
Yeah, rather than tip my hand here, I think I pretty much know the answer to this question based on the phrasing of the question. So I'm going to let the audience respond here, and then we'll get to the results. But I'll be surprised if I'm wrong.
I like surprises. It'd be fun if it's surprising.
And, this is a concern that I look at as a director. Do you get the pushback? So it'll be interesting to see what the audience feels.
Are we ready to see some results?
I think so.
I'm looking at a lot.
Okay, so here I am a little surprised, and so I'll say what I thought the overwhelming response was going to be. I thought it was yes, and the reason is, as I sort of indicated as the question was being asked, is that the part of the question is being that if you remove TSR from the incentive program, I think this is one of the things that ends up that boards definitely need to consider, is that there is this mounting pressure. There's this the first mounting pressure is shifting your equity program into performance contingent equity programs. The second mounting pressure, we've seen a significant increase in prevalence on that. The second mounting pressure is that making those performance contingent programs, sort of incorporating a TSR metric in those performance contingent programs. So once you actually go down that road and implement a total shareholder return program in your incentive program, I find it to be very difficult to go back. So any movement into introducing it, even if it's a smaller percentage, say 20% or so, in your incentive program, I think you would find significant pressure that in subsequent years if you decrease that weighting or remove the metric entirely. And so that's why I thought that the overall response would be yes. And what I think the advice is that if you currently don't have total shareholder return in your program and you're thinking about it, this is one of those things that you cut once, measure twice type of situations. And I'm actually glad to see that 36% of the respondents don't currently have total shareholder return in their incentive plans. I guarantee you're going to be talking about it. For those 36% of the population, I guarantee you'll be talking about it this year. And hopefully you'll make the decision that is actually the best for the company rather than following everyone else and jumping off the bridge. Okay. So I think that actually brings us to the third agenda item, if you will, which is making equity grants serve your leadership strategy. And really the fundamental question here is can equity grants play a more significant role in ensuring executives are aligned with long-term interests? And and the genesis of that fundamental question is really something that we touched on earlier, and it's a question that I actually get asked very often, which is, does a grant that vests annually over a 3-year period truly reflect a long-term outlook? And so I'm just going to pause there for a second and wondering, Mary Beth, do you have any thoughts on that sort of question that I probably get asked at every single board meeting I attend?
In terms of the equity grants and all of that?
The equity grants and the fact that the majority practice is to have a 3 or 4 year vesting period, but that 3 or 4 year vesting period is vests annually over that time period.
Yeah, I think I don't see 4 years a lot. I really see the 3 years. Management would like 1 year vesting, so I think you get some pushback there. But I've not seen it go out longer, so I think it's going to have to be something that we if it's in concert with the full plan, that long-term value creation, I think we can extend that out longer. But I think right now they're still looking at the 3 years as being something typical that how the vesting period is, and so I think that's going to be work in progress.
Yeah, and so we're sort of seeing the same thing, is that something that is starting to be talked about, even though it's a minority practice, is whether or not companies should start considering lengthening the vesting schedule. And this is really for sort of the highest levels of management, or continued vesting post an individual's departure. And so, I'll touch on the sort of the second point, because that probably is the more controversial one. But the second point on continued vesting post departure is really sort of focuses on, can you attempt to hold an individual accountable for the long-term consequences of decisions that they're making when they're in the job, post their being involved with the company, and essentially beyond their tenure. So it's an interesting concept, and I think there's a good amount of pros for it as well as cons. But it really gets to the heart of how long-term should the outlook be for your senior executive team. And if you're making decisions today that will impact stock price, a year from now, 3 years from now, your equity program is probably aligned for that currently. But if you're making decisions now for something that's going to be 5, 7, 10 years down the road impact, then the equity program is probably falling short. And frankly, there are some companies out there that have had some good success with long vesting or vesting until retirement. But frankly, you can see sort of the cons of doing that on the page here. But I think one con that's not on the page is actually an important con, is that many companies can't afford to do so because there is a trade-off in terms of grant value. You may have to put a much higher grant value in place for that individual in order for the exchange for a longer vesting, or a vesting that's post their actual tenure.
Well, I'm curious, if you did extend it out, the 5 years, besides the issue you've just brought up concerning the cost of doing that, it's not consistent with what the clawback issue is, going back 3 years when somebody has left the company. You can go back to the 3 years. So, I think there's going to be some robust discussion around how they determine it and what the year numbers are to be consistent. Do you think that's going to play a role in it, in their decisions?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the short answer to that is I think it absolutely has to, and I think it's actually the right thing to do.
So with that, should we move on to our next couple of polling questions and see what's on our audience's mind? Okay. So here is our next audience polling question on the subject of equity compensation. What is the primary purpose of your company's equity awards? And we've got 3 answers here: retention, performance alignment, and delivery of competitive compensation. Interesting choices.
Yeah,
hard to choose.
and frankly, equity programs try to do all 3. But I think the main point here is that you should understand what is the main purpose, the primary purpose of your equity program, and structure your equity program accordingly.
So I'm sorry.
No, not at all, Sharon. I mean, I was just going to add the caveat, even if it goes against prevailing market practice, because I think even in your CD&A, you'll have a good story to tell.
Let's see what people had to say.
Okay. Not surprising at all, with approximately 60% saying that it should be performance alignment. And frankly, you're finding that the data shows that, as I said, over the past 5-6 years, there's been a significant uptick in the prevalence and weighting of using performance contingent equity instruments within the equity program versus using restricted stock and stock options. However, I will say that based on our most recent studies of top 200 companies as well as companies within the sort of the 500 million and 3 billion revenue range, it was pretty consistent across both size categories that the majority of companies are implementing a balanced portfolio approach where they're using stock options, restricted stock, and performance contingent shares, or they're using restricted stock and performance contingent shares. So you can see sort of this balancing of performance alignment, delivering competitive compensation and retention.
Great.
And shareholders really, when you talk to them, or at least when our CEO and chairs talk to them, they're really all about performance alignment. So that's really good, and it's really consistent by these results.
Right.
Let's move on to our next quick polling question. Would your management team be receptive to a longer vesting schedule or a holding period?
This is going to be a good one because, frankly, I don't know what the outcome is going to be in terms of the result. Mary Beth, you may have actually dealt with more diverse management teams than I have. Maybe you think you know what the result is going to be, but I'm interested to find out myself.
Yeah, so am I.
All right, let's take a look.
Okay. I guess the follow-up polling question would, probably should have been is that would you as directors like longer vesting?
We'll get there.
or holding periods for your executives. So 77% of you, as you can see on the slide here, is you're thinking that this is going to be a tough conversation for your management team.
Yeah.
And you may be very supportive of the management team's desire not to have this, but I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have this year.
And it does. It actually plays into the communication theme and the importance of making sure that your management team understands what you're trying to do and why. So with that, it's sort of a indirect segue, but it's a segue nonetheless onto our next topic for our agenda items, which is preparation for the new disclosure requirements, which has the communication link, which is why I get to talk to this particular slide. So first what I'm going to do is just quickly summarize the rules. I think that we've talked about these before in previous NACD webcasts, so I'll try to keep that part brief. First, let's start with the clawback rule, which is still proposed, and I will say we were having discussions this morning about when we might expect the clawback and pay versus performance proposed rules to be finalized. I think there were some expectations that we might hear something by the end of the year, but given that it's December 9th, we're not so sure. So the implications of these rules are not terribly close, but I think that there's lots to know and start planning for. So the clawback proposed rule says that exchange-listed companies must adopt, enforce, and disclose a policy providing for recovery of erroneously paid incentive compensation from executive officers during the 3 fiscal years preceding a financial restatement due to material noncompliance with any financial reporting requirement. And so as proposed, this rule applies to all current and former Section 16 officers. We also know that incentive compensation includes performance-based restricted stock awards and stock options, which could make the estimates of recoverable comp difficult. Next rule, quickly, is the CEO pay ratio, one of our finalized rules. It was finalized in August. And to quickly reiterate the rule, it's pretty straightforward. Starting in 2018, companies will be required to disclose in their proxy statements the ratio between CEO pay and the median employee pay. And as you probably know or may be experiencing with your HR management teams, many companies are already in the process of doing the deep analysis now to determine exactly who their median employee is going to be. Finally, the last rule is the pay versus performance rule, which is a bit of a mouthful. It requires public companies to disclose specific information about CEO and average NEO pay in a table that looks at the relationship between pay and performance over a 5-year time frame. Specifically, the table will need to include for each covered fiscal year, I'm going to run down the list, total CEO compensation as reported in the summary compensation table, the compensation actually paid to the CEO, which is different than the summary comp table pay. Actual pay includes equity values when vested rather than when granted, as well as the current year's pension service costs. The table also needs to include the average total compensation of the NEOs other than the CEO, as reported in the summary comp table, as well as the average compensation actually paid. The company's cumulative TSR for each covered fiscal year and the peer group's cumulative TSR for each covered fiscal year. Doesn't end there. In addition, companies must also describe the relationship between the compensation actually paid and their TSR, as well as the relationship between their TSR and the TSR of the peer group. And this part can be in a narrative or a graphical form around the table or both. So now that we've got the lay of the land of the actual rules, let's talk about some of the implications for disclosure purposes as well as some unintended internal communication implications. Going back to the clawbacks, as I said, the rule is not finalized. However, there are many companies who are choosing to review what they have in place now and have started drafting their policies. The rule says that in any year where a financial restatement is completed or a recoverable amount is outstanding, you're going to have to disclose detailed information in the proxy statement about the amount of the excess compensation to each of the individuals subject to the clawback. You will have to name names. Why the company decided not to pursue recovery if that applies, and any outstanding balances of 180 days or more yet to be recovered. So there are some companies who are actually considering drafting mock disclosures, assuming they have this type of circumstance, even though it's probably rare. It's good to have in your back pocket. From an internal perspective, you'll also want to make sure that your HR teams are planning for the internal communication implications of a new clawback policy. So, for example, how it affects grant letters, grant administration documents that are provided to participants, and probably the most complicated, what to and how to reach out to departed officers about the new policies and their potential future liabilities. Next, my personal favorite, the CEO pay ratio, which we've been talking about a lot over the past few months since it is the only rule that's been finalized. Over this time, we've heard lots of recurring themes in the boardroom that boards may actually have little impact or even responsibility for the CEO pay ratio issue beyond ensuring it's accurately accounted for in the proxy. So with that, I think, yes, it's a good time to start drafting some mock disclosure to figure out what your narrative is going to be, take advantage of, telling the story around how your business works and what the story is to support the rationale for your CEO pay ratio numbers. For example, if you've got lots of part-time or seasonal workers, that may affect your number. However, we believe, and this is why this is part of the agenda items list, that beyond the proxy, it's up to the board to ensure that HR management is preparing to get ahead of the foreseeable corporate risk of significant employee fallout once the disclosure is public. In particular, there should be concerns about the reactions of high-potential employees who believe they should be earning more than they do as compared to the median salary. These are pretty smart people, and it's likely that they're savvy enough to start shopping around at competitors, specifically because now they're going to have the opportunity to compare median salaries across industries. If someone sees a higher median salary at a competitor, they may ask themselves if they're working for the right employer. So even if people don't start taking action immediately, we have to ask ourselves, what is the cost of their potential demotivation, and how can you ensure that critical talent stays engaged in the business and committed to driving strategic objectives? So our suggestion is that over the next year, you bring your HR management teams into the boardroom to present recommendations for a compensation communication strategy. Management and the board should agree on messages about pay philosophy, competitive benchmarking, long-term wealth creation, career advancement opportunities, governance, and processes that apply to how compensation works for employees at the entire company, not just the NEOs. HR should be planning manager training and education sessions. There should also be escalation plans in place to ensure that when the toughest questions come up, and I guarantee you they will come up, that the right people are ready to respond successfully. So with the appropriate groundwork, and we've got the time since this isn't going to happen until 2018, you can mitigate this workforce risk. And we believe that if we do this, by the time the ratio is disclosed in 2018, employees should be educated enough about how they're paid at your company that comparing their pay to the median is a waste of time and energy. And then finally, and quickly, we have the proposed pay for performance rules. Frankly, we're not surprised by the fact that TSR is the only metric in the rule, and we know that it's likely not sufficient for telling the right story about the relationship between pay and performance and how the compensation committee makes its decisions about pay. So even though the rule isn't final, we expect it will be relatively soon, and there's lots of pre-work to be done. We suggest that companies start modeling scenarios now, as well as start working on the surrounding narratives. So with this in mind, I'm going to turn the discussion back to Alap to see us through the rest of the presentation and help us dig a little deeper into what you can be doing now to plan in advance.
Yeah, so on the fourth agenda item, I think the headline here is very simple. It's prepare early, as early as you possibly can. And I'm not trying to be Chicken Little here, but I think there's some significant implications of these rules and how your employees and investors are going to look at them. So the important thing to remember here on the pay versus performance rule is that the mandate does not mean that you need to incorporate total shareholder return as a metric, but recognizes that the relationship between compensation and TSR is going to be under an even more focused spotlight. So as we've said before, craft a program that makes sense for your employees and for your company within the context of your business cycle. I think that's the most important takeaway. So quickly, I think we'll go over to the next polling question. And I think on this particular polling question here, as you answer, you submit your responses, I think the CEO pay ratio is getting the most attention, but frankly, I think the pay versus performance proposals as the most troublesome one. So let's see what everyone else thinks. See the results, please.
And you're right.
And I am right. It doesn't happen often, but I frankly think the pay ratio thing is going to be sort of a one and done type of thing, but the pay for performance is going to be a continued thorn in the side of companies. So with that, I think we'll move on to the last agenda item, and we're saving the best for last, is aligning director compensation with the expanded roles and responsibilities. And as you're all acutely aware, director compensation has come under increased scrutiny just over the past 2-3 years. And even to the effect that recent litigation, we're talking here about the Citrix litigation, as well as other shareholder lawsuits on the overall value of director compensation. And so as directors, the interesting part about this is that the scrutiny has come at a time when directors are experiencing a significant increase in responsibility and risk associated with their positions. So the question for companies is, how do you balance the spotlight that has been shined on director compensation with the significant increase in the job responsibility? And I think one of the ways that you can think about attempting to strike a balance is re-examining your compensation program and zeroing in on actually the equity, the structure of your equity program, whether it's being delivered in fixed shares versus fixed value. And you can see sort of the pros and cons here on the page on using fixed shares versus fixed values, but primarily the construct here falls under two camps. Do you believe directors should be performance-driven, and so in a sense think like an activist but act like a director, where a performance-oriented program may help focus directors on unlocking value for the company and long-term sustained value? Or do you believe that directors should really be focused on and driven by governance and service to service to the shareholders, and be less concerned with performance and stock price appreciation? I would argue that the both approaches have merit. Fixed value approach tends to be the most common in the marketplace, but as you can see on the page, there's some significant pros and cons of each. On the con side on fixed share, I think the most important one here is that you could have an unintended value outcome, and frankly, if you have an increasing stock price, obviously that's going to grab a headline, and you could have a very high director compensation amount. But complexity may actually be very significant for a board that is dealing with a substantially decreasing stock price. So I'm not sure if that alignment is properly calibrated. But bottom line is that regardless of the approach that you take, consideration should also be given on thinking about extending vesting and or holding requirements, similar to what we were suggesting boards examine for the executives. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to our last polling question, and I think potentially our most controversial polling question. So I was taught very early on that there's points where I should keep my mouth shut, and I think I'm going to keep my mouth shut and let all of you answer this question, and we'll take a look at the result. So I think we could probably go to the result.
Wow.
Wow. Mary Beth, are you sort of falling off your chair or wherever you're sitting? I am surprised. Are you?
Well, I am very surprised that they're wanting that to opine on it. However, given the Citrix lawsuit that's out there and the awareness, maybe by having this, it gives you some protection that they approve your pay and lessens the lawsuits and litigation possibility. But I am surprised that people feel that way. So that's why these polls are good to get the results here.
Yeah, wow, 67%. Wow, saying yes, there should. Okay. So, Mary Beth, I think I'll turn it over to you to do a quick sort of key takeaways, and maybe if I think there's maybe some questions in the queue from the audience.
Sure, I'll give just a few takeaways. Then Ronell is going to come back on and talk about a few things, and then we'll get to the few questions we have time remaining. So remember, your planning and preparation is really key. Usually the comp committee only meets 4 times in a year, and given the full agenda and the full priorities, you need to really do it at each meeting and get this moving forward. Put TSR in the appropriate place. We talked about that, and there's some great questions on that particular topic. And if not TSR, how do you communicate why you chose not to use that? I think looking at how you extend the equity grants you talked about from 3 to 5 years or 4 years, whatever the right number is for your company develop the plans for the coming regulations, because they may not be totally finalized, but you're going to have something that you will have to deal with in those areas. And consider the trending interest, I think, in board compensation. So I leave you with have a plan and have a process to deal with all of these issues. So I'm going to turn it over briefly to Ronell to go through some housekeeping areas, and then we'll address some of the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Mary Beth. This will be very brief. Please don't miss out on our next webinar in this series. Join us, ANACD, and Pearl Meyer for the Pearl Meyer's Annual Directors Compensation Report. It will be live again on January 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please check nacdonline.org/webinars to register. Mary Beth, go ahead and take over for questions.
Okay, we have a lot of questions, a lot of interest. We can only get to a few. So the first one was, we have no interest in including TSR in our long-term incentive plan, as we believe other measures, including EPS, are better. So they're asking, are you advocating, should we use TSR? Aaron, follow-up?
Yeah, so I think what I'm advocating here is talk to your consultant, or frankly give me a call, talk to me. And I think what we should do is do some additional testing as to what metrics have a high correlation to total shareholder return, and potentially use those metrics in your incentive program rather than total shareholder return. Because what I would like to do is ensure that the management team is empowered to drive results for the company, and then drive and then by that association drive the total shareholder return.
Great. Next question talks about that we've talked a lot about the investors' reaction to compensation, but what about how do we drive behavior for management with all of these changes that are coming in front of us?
And I think that's an excellent question, and something that I know I've been talking a lot about with my clients is that you can design the best, most market-driven compensation program, but if it isn't tuned into the cultural makeup of your executive team or the risk profile of your executive team, it's going to fail miserably. So what I think the board needs to do is work with management and figure out what drives their behavior, what is motivating to them in terms of structure, and again have the desire to then potentially buck market trends to ensure that the future value creation of the company is secured by implementing a program that makes sense for the management team.
I think we may have only one question left here time-wise. Comment was made the average CEO lasts about 7 years in his or her position. Is 5 years really the right number for long-term incentive? Is that an appropriate number, the length of time?
Again, I would tend to think so. I understand why we've sort of done 3 to 4 years in the past, but if you start thinking about a CEO and the long-standing impact any CEO, even if their tenure is, say, 7 years or even less, has on the company, I think having something that is a 5-year and potentially sort of a post retirement or post departure holding makes a lot of sense, because they should understand the long-term implications of whatever programs they put in place.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the time that we have. I want to thank everyone here on the call and Pearl Meyer for putting this program together.